به نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وهادينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع نفوسنا حبيب إله العالمين ولا حبيب إلا هو وأهله الذي سمع في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فإنما العسر يسرا إنما العسر يسرا آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Truly and undoubtedly, every year as we go through all of the various social, economic, financial, sort of communal challenges that our communities often endure, there's so much conversation about when and why not now in terms of the reappearance of our Imam, the awaited Savior, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah. In fact, every time we go through any hardship, we go through any difficulty, we hear about the earthquakes that have just taken place, or a couple of years ago when we experienced the pandemic. Always there's this conversation, and oftentimes for good intention, this zeal, and this excitement potentially even for us to be exposed to the light of the Imam alayhi salatu wassalam. And coupled with that, we have so many people who ask questions around, for instance, the end of times, and they look to find signs around these end of times. And so much of our lives can be consumed by a reflection, a contemplation of, or even sort of a desire to fall into this rabbit hole potentially of all of the signs of end of times as narrated, not only within our hadith literature, but also as often passed down from family to family, from generation to generation. And it's important to keep in mind that historically, followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam have gone through an immense amount of hardship and difficulty. Of course, we don't need to trace it back any further, for instance, than the day in which the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa sallam left this world. But if you just fast forward year to year, Imam to Imam, even if we take a look and we study the history of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, we know the difficulty of Imam Ali, of Imam al-Hassan, of Imam al-Hussein. But even when you take a look at the latter Imams of Ahlul Bayt and their companions and their communities, just how much challenges that they had to endure and everything that they had to encounter, to the extent that our ahadith, many of these traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that were passed down from generation to generation during the time of the Imams, peace and blessings be upon them, they had to be done so secretly. I'll give you one example. The example of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam and Zurara ibn A'yun. Zurara ibn A'yun is one of the most important narrators of hadith that we have within our tradition. He was a companion of Imams al-Baqir and al-Sadiq alayhim salam. Zurara ibn A'yun used to sit in the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam in Medina, and he would pretend to be asleep. And he would sit next to Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and the Imam would pretend to be reading or pretend to be writing. And he would be narrating traditions on the authority of his grandfather, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and Zurara would be memorizing them. And then he would rush home just to write it down, just so those words can be preserved, because of just how difficult the political situation was, where they were so vigilant and watchful over every single action of the Imam alayhi salam, and those of his close confidants as well. You fast forward, and we just saw this from some of the youth speeches as well. The representatives, the Safara of Imam al-Zaman, Nawab al-Arba'a, these representatives of the Imam, peace and blessings be upon them, the difficulty that they had as well. Hussein ibn Rawh al-Nobakhti, who was the third and the most prominent of these four individuals, if you go ahead and take a look at his biography, and you go and you see how Muslims in that early period define Hussein ibn Rawh al-Nobakhti, you will find that amongst the Shia, They claim him as amongst the most important, of course, of the representatives of Imam al-Zaman, and of course, one of the most important and elite members of the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. What's incredible, though, is that Hussein ibn Rawh al-Nabakhti is also seen as a Sunni by Sunnis because of just how strategic he had to be in that particular society in Baghdad. In other words, that he could not even expose what he truly believed in his heart of hearts, which is why everyone wants to claim someone like Hussein ibn Rawh and Nabakhti, radwanullahi ta'ala alayh. I say all of this, my friends, so that we can understand that difficulty and hardship and stress is something that every community historically had fallen into. It is the nature and the sunnah of this world that we live in. And it's important for us to navigate them, all of those hardships and all of those difficulties, those trials and tribulations, and find God in the midst of the journey, undoubtedly. But for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I wanted to talk specifically about how we understand a lot of the literature or a lot of the rhetoric around the end of times. Because whenever we talk about Imam al-Mahdi, again, what is such a common discourse is the signs before his reappearance. And for today's discussion, inshallah, I want to take a look at how we navigate all of these signs of the return of the Imam alayhim salam in three different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of how we understand dealing with or navigating the societal challenges, the obstacles, the trials, the tribulations that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Number two, how do we read all of these signs about the end of times? And how do we compare them to what it is that we're actually going through on a day-to-day basis today? And thirdly, and finally, what are our responsibilities in light of these signs to Imam Sahib al-Zaman, Ajjarallahu ta'ala farajah. So let's go right into discussion point number one, which is how do we approach these societal challenges? When we hear of an earthquake, we hear of a pandemic, we hear about any hardship that takes place in community, so many people, they jump and they say, this must be the end of the world. The Imam is going to come any day now. And we see this again as not something that is not, this is not something, in other words, that is totally encouraged. Of course, it's good to remember the end of times. Of course, it's good to remember Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjarallahu ta'ala farajah. But it's a bit problematic that every single time that we go through anything as a larger community, we jump to, this must be the end of times. Because what takes place then is that for many people, we despair and we think that there's no way out and we don't have any responsibility ourselves. Let me try to elucidate this point just a bit. Within Islamic tradition, there's this emphasis on positivity, not on negativity. We need to emphasize the glass half full approach as to in sort of contrast to the glass is half empty. In other words, let's see the good in every circumstance that we encounter or that we endure on a day-to-day experience. Of course, when we see hardship and we see difficulty, the first thought that should come to my mind is, how can I be useful? How can I be of service? In a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he states, إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِأَبْدِهِ خَيْرًا إِسْتَعْمَلْهُ. He states that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for somebody, for one of his servants, what he does, azza wa jal, is that he makes that person useful. At this moment, the companions of the Messenger of God, they stated, O Messenger of God, and what does it mean to be useful? To which the Messenger of God, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, listen to this. He responds, he states that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves someone, he makes them useful by allowing for them to contribute to supporting others in their time in this dunya before they leave. Meaning that when we are privileged to be in a position of service to others, not only via our wealth, of course, our wealth could be one way, but via our tongue, via our body, via our actions, via our time, via our advices, via our listening, whatever it might be. If we are in a position to serve somebody else, that is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed for us to be his vessel, his representative on earth at that given moment. Similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the whole Quran, in the verses that I began with, famous and oft-quoted, فَإِنَّمَا الْأُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّمَا الْأُسْرِ يُسْرًا, that with every difficulty, there is ease. Undoubtedly, with every difficulty, there is ease. In other words, take this positive approach. Don't always jump to, oh, this must be the end of times, and don't dismiss, again, your responsibility, our collective responsibility, and just say, oh, the Imam's going to pick up sort of the slack, and we don't have to do anything, And it's something naturally that we innately teach our family members and we teach our children. I say this to my kids all the time. We live in New York, and when you go to New York City, it's not the cleanest place. And my young daughters, who are 7 and 5, they always say, oh, we don't like to go to this area because, X area, Y area, because there's always trash on the street. Why is there so much trash on the street? Why is it so dirty? Why is it this and why is it that? And I always tell them that either, we pick up at the end of the day, either we pick up our own trash and put it in the bin, or we wait for someone else to do it. At the end of the day, we have responsibility. You can't go into your kitchen and say, why are none of the dishes done? If none of the dishes are done, you go and you wash the dishes yourself. You don't wait for somebody else to do it. Similarly, as a society, as a community more broadly, if we consistently focus on a rhetoric around the end of times, around, oh, the Imam is going to come back and do this and do that. No, we are dismissing our responsibility from it and also sort of negligent of the fact that if I put forth my effort, number one, I'm being of good service, and that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends for me. But at the same time, in addition to that, there can be some goodness that can potentially come out of it. وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions within the whole Quran. Let me just make one more point with regards to this. Within a sort of framework as taught to us by the Hadith of the Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, not only should we be positive in our approach to anything that we're undergoing or anything that we're experiencing, but it's really important for that positivity to also be coupled with a sense of hope, hopefulness and not hopelessness. When we talk, or when many people talk about Imam al-Mahdi, alayhi salatu wassalam, there's a lot of, again, rhetoric around negativity and despair. The Imam is not here. What are we going to do? The Imam is, yes, it's okay to be sad that the Imam is not in our presence. It's encouraged. We see this in Dua Nudba, and there's Du'as of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam that we read, but not in a way that we should get down on ourselves. In a way that devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for instance, when we commit a sin, when we transgress the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're supposed to humble ourselves in front of God. It's okay to demonstrate our weakness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We should have tears in our eyes when we're devoting ourselves to Allah, particularly in these nights of Sha'ban, in these nights of Ramadan, and so on and so forth. But if I do, or if I commit an act of wrongdoing, and then for a week I'm depressed and I treat my family poorly because I committed a sin, because I'm depressed and I'm sad and I'm hopeless or whatever it might be, that's not contributing to any positivity in my own sort of environment. Similarly, I'm supposed to have sadness in my heart that the Imam alayhi salam is not in my company, undoubtedly. But at the same time, I have to have some hope and I have to be positive. And again, I have to fulfill my own responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is point number one. Let me move to dimension number two of my discussion. And that is with posing the question of then how exactly do we read all of these signs about the end of times? There's so many signs that are mentioned within books of Hadith, coupled with, of course, that which has been passed down for us ancestrally or generationally, saying that X and Y and Z are all signs of the end of times. And really, if you go through some of these reports, you're going to think that every single day the Imam is going to return tomorrow, or every single day the Day of Judgment is tomorrow. And again, that is, something that is so common amongst people, believe it or not. First of all, it's important to remember that when the Imam alayhi salam returns, Ajrallahu ta'ala farajat, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasten his reappearance, for the hadith, it states, أكثروا الدعاء لتأجيل الفرج فإن ذلك فرجكم, that increase your supplication and your dua for the reappearance of the Imam, for surely in that is your victory and your success as well. So undoubtedly, we seek that from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but at the end of the day, it's not in my hands. It's in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands. There's some things that I have control over, and there are some things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has control over. That which I have control over, I got to put forth my best effort. I got to be focused. I got to be diligent. I got to do the best that I possibly can. And similarly, that which God has control over, we submit to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we read these signs, and there are those signs that say, for instance, that there's going to be a lot of earthquakes, or that people are going to listen to music frequently, or people that are going to be very consumed with the dunya, or whatever it might be. In reality, again, if you rewind historically, you'll see that at every single generation, there was this belief that this is the year that the Imam, Ajarallahu ta'ala faraja, is going to return. But we do not essentially and fundamentally have control over that. That's number one, to submit to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has power and authority over this. Secondly, there's a lot of people who actually look within these narrations without understanding, and they want to feel that this world is falling all around them. I know it sounds kind of crazy, that why would somebody actually want to sort of look through a lens of only seeing the negativity in the world? Like we know there are a lot of people who have a lot of different perceptions, and they want to be the one to guide religious text as opposed to allowing for religious text to guide them. Thirdly, it's important to also keep in mind, as an abundance of our ulama historically have spoken to as well, just a lot of the inauthenticity of many of the reports that speak to the end of times. And many of those that are undoubtedly authentic, that speak to the end of times or to the return of the Imam, Ajarallahu ta'ala faraja, that we have to read them contextually. It's important to read them contextually. In other words, that some things we understand within the text, some things we don't understand. And so it's important not to get too emotionally tied to them. And again, consistently believe that, again, any day or tomorrow undoubtedly is going to be the end of the world, for instance. Because again, it doesn't serve us any good in terms of our fulfilling of responsibilities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyhow, that being said, I wanted to respond to a couple of frequently asked questions around the signs of the return of Imam Sahib az-Zaman. Firstly, what are some of these signs that undoubtedly we know, as taught to us by Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, are guaranteed prior to his coming? In what are known as alamat al-hatmiyyah. We have 5, according to our ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, 5 important signs that undoubtedly are going to take place prior to the return of Imam Sahib az-Zaman, Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraja, and the rest of them are subject to change or not necessarily prerequisites prior to the coming of the Imam. What are these 5 signs? The first one of these, and this was also mentioned by one of our youth prior to my talk as well, the first one of these is the rise of the Yamani, an individual who will come and he will call others to the support of the Imam, Ajjarallahu ta'ala faraja. He will tell the community that the Imam alayhi salam is approaching, so be prepared for his return. And he is again someone who is an ally, who is someone who is in support of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. Secondly, the second sign prior to the coming of Imam Sahib az-Zaman is the rise of the Sufyani. Again, an individual who will call to the opposition of Imam Sahib az-Zaman, Ajjarallahu ta'ala faraja. Someone who will embody all of the most sort of evil qualities of vice and stand in opposition to anyone who supports the Yamani and anyone who supports Imam Sahib az-Zaman, alayhi salatu wassalam. Thirdly, a call will be made from the sky from Jibreel. What exactly is this call? According to our hadith, it is stated that a call will be made from the sky stating, Al-Haq ma'a Ali wa shi'atihi, that truth is with Ali and his followers, peace and blessings upon Ali and his brother Rasulullah, and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. In other words, perhaps metaphorically, perhaps accurately, again, we don't really know, but what we do know is that there will be this call that is made from the sky, speaking to this notion that support is with Ali alayhi salatu wasalam and the followers of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. The fourth, as we are taught, and again, there are details around these that are narrated within books of Hadith, and you can find them. But undoubtedly, what we want to focus on is at least that which is verified via text, and the details, that's for another discussion. The fourth one of these signs is the killing of an-nafs az-zaki, what is translated as the pure soul. And we are told that an-nafs az-zaki comes from ex-progeny, and he looks like this, and so on and so forth, according to some other hadith as well. But nonetheless, on a most basic level, that this an-nafs az-zaki, this pure soul, is a man who is a follower of Imam al-Mahdi, ajjalallahu ta'ala faraja, who will preach on behalf of the Imam in the holy city of Mecca, and he will be killed between the Rukn al-Yamani and Maqam Ibrahim, in front of the holy Kaaba. And we know, وَمَنْ دَخَلَهُ كَانَ آمِنًا, that is the sacred precinct where no blood is to be shed, yet that this supporter of Imam Sahib al-Zaman will be killed at this location. And fifthly, and finally, the last sign, which we know undoubtedly will take place as a guaranteed sign prior to the coming of the Imam, alamat al-hatmiyya, is that the earth, by the miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will swallow up Sufyani, the sort of individual who calls in opposition to Imam, and his followers, in a place known as Bayda, which is a location between the cities of Mecca and Medina. So when these things take place, these are the sort of last moments prior to the establishment of the return of our Imam, alayhi salatu wassalam. A second frequently asked question that many ask is there then a specific time that's been stipulated about the Imam's return? Is it in a specific year? Is it on a specific day? No. The Imams, peace and blessings be upon them, have made it, have been very, very clear and stated numerous times there is no specific time, no specific year, no specific day, but rather it is totally and entirely up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, numerous hadith state, for instance, كَذَبَ الْوَقَاتُونَ, that surely those who specify a particular time, they are liars. So if you read something online, you get a WhatsApp message, you get an email saying next Friday, for instance, that the Imam alayhi salam is returning, you can't hold anything to that. It doesn't mean, in other words, none of that holds any value in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam have strongly warned their followers to not get caught up. And historically, there have been those who have claimed, until today, there are many of those who claim that the Imam alayhi salam is going to return at X or Y or Z time. But that being said, we do have hadith that offer some general guidelines or general descriptions. For instance, we have a hadith that says that the Imam will return on a Friday, and the Imam will return near the Holy Kaaba, or that the Imam will return in an odd year. But again, nothing specific, but rather just general guidelines for us to sort of keep in mind, or that increase our knowledge or our ma'rifah of Imam Sahib al-Zaman, ajjalallahu ta'ala faraja. And a third frequently asked question, and this is super important, my dear friends, is that when the Imam alayhi salam returns, what will be the state of the believers? Meaning, will we know? Because we worry that we won't have the exposure to the Imam alayhi salam that we are seeking. It is said that one day, a man, he comes to one of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, and he states that when the awaited Savior, he makes his return, he says, how will we know? How will we know that that is him? To which the Imam alayhi salam, he points up to the sun, And he utters this line. He states, Inna amruna abyanu min ash-shams. He states, surely our affair is clearer than the sun. In other words, that for the believer, we will know. Our responsibility is to fulfill our duties and our obligations to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to strive our best. And it's hard right now without being in the company of the Imam Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraja. It's very difficult. We say this in the dua al-iftitah, which we're going to be reciting inshaAllah ta'ala during the holy month of Ramadan. Allahumma nashku ilayka faqda nabiyyina salawatuka alayhi wa ala wa ghaybata waliyina wa kathrata aduwina wa qillata adadina. Oh Allah, we're complaining to you. We complain to you that we don't have a prophet who we can go back to, who we can see, who we can spend time with. We complain to you, O Allah, that our Imam alayhi salam, the representative of God on earth, is an occultation. We complain to you, O Allah, that our numbers are few. There's only a few followers. And we complain to you, O Allah, that our enemies are many. But at the end of the day, we have solace in the fact that if we remain steadfast on belief and we have conviction in this faith, and if we desire to be in the company of the Imam alayhi salam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will facilitate that sense of clarity for us. I will say this, my friends, and I repeat this to my community here all the time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He wants us to be successful. He does not want us to have to go through difficulties and struggles in order to get closer to Him. And if the Imam of our time is the means and the access point that allows for us to know Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we know that undoubtedly that through ma'rifah of the Imam of our time, we have the capacity to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then why would God make it difficult and challenging? Why? That's not the case. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it so many times in the whole Quran that this is a book that is easy. It's meant to be easy. It's meant to be clear, right? Of course, there are depths in terms of its meaning, but on the most surface level, anyone can understand it. It speaks of the oneness of God, tells us to reflect upon the sun and the stars and the oceans and the rivers. It tells us to remind ourselves of a world beyond this one, a day of judgment. It tells us about certain anecdotes about the prophets. Yes, we complicate things, or yes, we desire to gain more details, and that's fine, and that's good, and that's undoubtedly encouraged. But anyone can perceive, can know. Similarly, with Imam Sahib al-Zaman, Ajjarallahu ta'ala faraja, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to utilize him as a means to get to Allah. He wants that. This is why he has given us this Imam, which is why he has given us the whole Quran, coupled with Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. So do not worry. So do not worry, in other words, because if we put forth our best effort, then inshallah we will see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will facilitate for us a means to know him and to see him, again, provided that we fulfill our duties and our responsibilities to him, azza wa jal. And that brings me then to the third dimension of the discussion, which is in specific, what are these duties and responsibilities? I will say this, my friends, that we many a times complicate things a lot more than we actually need to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like I said before, he wants this path toward getting to him to undoubtedly come with trials and tribulations. But essentially, fulfilling our responsibilities to the Imam of our time are not meant to be so difficult or not meant to be so challenging. At the very least, it means to fulfill our duties and our responsibilities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'll go through a couple of these points that are mentioned within our hadith. Our first responsibility to the Imam alayhi salam, undoubtedly, is to fulfill or to walk in the footsteps of Imam Sahib al-Zaman. To walk in his footsteps, what does that mean? If we want to be someone who draws closer toward Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, then undoubtedly emulating the character of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, are the first and foremost and most significant step that we need to take. We cannot recite dua nudba, for instance, every Friday and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to return the Imam so we can, remove all of the injustices and inequities of this world. Like we said before, We know that the responsibility of the Imam alayhi salam is to establish justice in this world. It's such a common theme within our tradition. We utter those hadiths all the time that when the Imam returns, he will eradicate all injustice and all inequity and replace it with justice and equity. We know that. It's something that we sort of mentioned day after night, night after day. But truly, my friends, let's pose, and I ask myself this firstly and foremostly, can I make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, dua nudba every Friday? Can I say, Allahumma ajilli waliyaka al-faraj, Allahumma kulli waliyaka al-hujjat ibn al-Hasan, every single night, seeking that justice of the Imam alayhi salam, if I can establish justice within my own house, if I can establish justice within my own community? Do you know how many people, just in the last month or so, the amount of young women, for instance, who have reached out to me telling me that their spouses or their fathers or their brothers have physically abused them. And over here, we call upon the hastening of the reappearance of the Imam of our time. We take these same hands and we beat our chests and we cry these tears in honor of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And then we take that same hand and we strike those who are closest to us from our family members. How does that make any sense? How can we truly ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to return Imam Sahib al-Zaman and establish justice in the world when we can't even allow for justice and equity to be established in our own households, in our own places of work, in our own places of employment, the way we treat our employees, not paying people equitably, so on and so forth. Think about these things. It's important that the first step that we take, if we truly want to fulfill our responsibilities to the Imam, is to walk in his footsteps. And if we know that he is the emblem of justice and equity, then I need to do the same, and I need to start in my own individual capacity. Number one. Number two, we know that the Imam alayhi salatu wassalam, one of his most important tasks is going to be to bring people together. And we see this as a sunnah of Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. And we know that the Imam of our time, he is going to follow the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, we have numerous hadith that state that his revolution is going to be similar to the revolution of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When the Prophet alayhi salam comes to Mecca, he sees just how fragmented that tribal community and society was. People were so distant, so divorced from one another. And what the Prophet ﷺ did was that he got those tribes to come together in a station of unity. He allowed for them to work together for a common good. He started focusing on values, that of mercy, that of beauty, that of compassion, that of justice, that of love. Imam Sahib al-Zaman, he will do the same exact thing. He will see the fragmentation of society and he will try to bring people together, again, for this common good and for this common will. And we see this within the whole Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, for instance, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً, that surely the believers are brothers, meaning they're supposed to work together. He states, for instance, لِتَعَارَفُوا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created people and he has placed them into nations, into tribes, not so that they segregate, not so that they, move distant from one another, but rather they come to a common word. They come to learn about one another. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, لا تفرقوا, do not do not separate from one another. Again, come together. The Imam alayhi salam will be the culmination, he'll be the glue that allows for that to take place. But what we can do is, again, we can start in our own capacity. You guys are the Unity Center, right? Within that same name, within that same frame, within that same lens, that we work toward establishing the sense of unity. We work together, we build together, we focus on the big things together. And like we know, not to sound cliche, not to sound like a commercial, but when we do things together, the potential to actually maximize our potential is that much greater. And that is what we're seeking from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is what we're seeking from Imam Sahib al-Zaman. And then thirdly, and I'll leave it with this, we have the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that states, "Aflalul ibadah intidar al-faraj." And we've often heard this, and it's oft quoted narration from the Prophet alayhi salam and from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, in which he states that the best act of worship is awaiting the return of the Imam alayhi salatu wassalam. And a hadith from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, narrated in Kitab al-Ghaiba of al-Nu'mani. Al-Nu'mani, by the way, just as a parenthesis, is a student of al-Kulayni, Sahib Kitab al-Kafi. He states, من سره أن يكون من أصحاب القائم فلينتظر وليأمل بالورع ومحاسن الأخلاق وهو منتظر. He states that the one who desires, now listen to this, and again, it's not rocket science. It's not meant to be difficult. It's not meant to be challenging. It's just meant to be a reminder of who and what we need to be. The Imam alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he states that the one who desires to be amongst the companions of the awaited Savior, فَلْيَنْتَظَرْ, then let him wait. But wait how? وَلْيَأْمَلْ بِالْوَرَعِ, then let him be someone who acts in such a way where he is vigilant over his actions. Meaning, in other words, be mindful over your deeds, have a sense of piety, remember God. وَمَحَاسِنُ الْأَخْلَاقِ, and let him or her purify their characteristics, their etiquette, their dealings with others, the way that you speak, the way that you engage, your interactions, your interpersonal sort of conversations, so on and so forth. وَهُوَ مُنْتَظَرٌ, and that is someone who is truly waiting. My friends, when the Imam alayhi salam is absent from us, and when the Imam is in our company, our responsibilities, they don't change at all. In other words, they don't change at all. Whether we were in the company of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, whether we were with Ali or with Hassan or with Hussein or with Imam Sahib al-Zaman, these are the same exact things that they were always calling to. Your own self, your own deeds, your own actions, your own our own responsibilities. I don't mean you as an I, to our family members and to our friends, toward those who are under our care. It's so important for us to be mindful of our deeds and of our actions. And that through these days in which we celebrate the birth of Imam al-Mahdi, ajjarallahu ta'ala faraja wa alayhi salatu wassalam, it's meant to be this rekindling, this reawakening of heart, where we remind ourselves of our responsibilities to others. We remind ourselves of our responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we wait with a sense of hopefulness, not with a sense of hopelessness. That we don't have despair when we see what difficulty is taking place in the world, but rather we figure out that way to fix it and to allow for this world to heal. I'll conclude with this. As the month of Ramadan is approaching, we often recite this famous dua. We say, for instance, after every prayer, Allahumma adkhil ala ahli al-qubur as-surur. Allahumma aghni kulla faqir. Allahumma ashbi' kulla ja'a. Allahumma ashfi kulla marid. Everyone knows these lines. In this line, or in this dua, we say, oh Allah, allow for the people who are going through difficulty, for their difficulty to be removed. For those who are sick, heal them. For those who are struggling financially, enrich them. For those who don't have food, give them food. For those who don't have drink, give them drink. So on and so forth. Correct? We know this dua. Now let me ask us all a question for us to reflect for just a moment. When we recite this dua, and when we say, oh Allah, for those who don't have any food, give them food, what are we expecting from this dua? Do we expect that all of a sudden Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to drop like a bunch of cheeseburgers on anyone who doesn't have any food? That'd be nice. That'd be wonderful. But actually, essentially, we're asking for two things. Number one is we're saying, oh Allah, allow for that one man, that hope, that Imam of ours. Oh Allah, allow for him to return back so that he can be the one who eradicates all of these injustices. Those who don't have finances, oh Allah, through him, enrich them. Oh Allah, through him, give them food. Oh Allah, through him, give them drink, right? On one level. But on another level, what are we calling to? We're saying, Allahumma aghni kulla faqir, Allahumma ashbi kulla ja'a, Allahumma ksu kulla uryan, Allahumma qdi dayna kulla madeen. Oh Allah, for those who don't have any clothes, clothe them. We are saying, oh Allah, give me the strength. Give me the ability to be that difference maker. If the Imam is not here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to say, where were you? If someone does not fulfill the responsibility to community, then it becomes us. And again, I remind myself before anyone else. The same way I tell my children I should be acting myself. If you don't know who's going to pick up the garbage, then you pick up the garbage. You don't know who's going to do the dishes, then you do the dishes. If you don't know who's going to feed the homeless, then let us be the one to feed the homeless. If we don't know who's going to be the one to provide money to this person begging on the side of the street, then let me be that person. That is what it means to walk in the footsteps of Sahib al-Zaman. Our responsibility to the Imam of our time is our responsibility to our community. Our responsibility and our love and adoration and our fidelity and our obedience to the awaited Savior, Al-Imam al-Mahdi, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hassan al-Askari, Arwahuna lahu al-Fida. At the end of the day, that means me being the best person that I can be and fulfilling my potential that I have in this world. And undoubtedly, we can do a lot more when we reflect and when we think and when we do it together. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq, to give us the ability to truly be amongst those who walk in these footsteps of Imam Sahib al-Zaman. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten his reappearance and to allow for us to be amongst his helpers and his supporters. Insha'Allah ta'ala. Allahumma ajil li waliyaka al-faraj wal-afiyata wal-nasr waj'alana wa awladana min al-ansarihi wa awana والذابين عنه والمستشهدين بين يدي برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلي يا ربي على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. If I could ask you all to please recite one surah al-Mubarakat al-Fatiha, but before that, one salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل